Okay, good morning. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at the GRASP on Robotics seminar series. I see a lot of new faces. Welcome to GRASP, welcome to PEN. I am Pratik Chaudhary. I'm the faculty host for today's talk. As a quick reminder, of the previously recorded talks can be found on the GRASP YouTube channel. Feel free to look at them. If you're joining via Zoom, please put your questions in the Q&A of Zoom, and then we'll say them out aloud during the talk. If you're here in person, of course, feel free to raise your hand and then ask a question. You can also ask questions at the end. We have about 15 minutes at the end of the talk for questions. Okay. Allow me to introduce the two student panelists for today's talk. Ife Shao is a first-year PhD student in electrical engineering. He works with me and Vijay Kumar on motion planning and control. Chris Su is a second-year PhD student in electrical engineering. He works with me on multi-robot control problems. Okay. Now, allow me to introduce the speaker. We have Professor Emilio Frazzoli from ETH Zürich today. He'll speak with us. Until 2021, he was the chief scientist of a company called Motional, which was the first company to build an autonomous taxi service. Motional used to be called Autonomy before. And he had founded this company back in 2014 with Carl Ingema at MIT. His main research interests are in robotics, autonomous systems, and intelligent urban mobility. And he has received a number of awards for this work. The most prominent among these are the 2015 George Axelby Award, the 2017 Kiyo Tomiyasu Award, and he is also an IEEE fellow. I think most of us in robotics know him by this algorithm called RRT star, rapidly exploring random trees. As a student, I worked with him many years ago. This is the algorithm that we would all love and worship. No thanks to him. And so this algorithm received the RSS Test of Time Award, probably the most commonly used algorithm for motion planning today after MPC. As a former professor at MIT, he directed a research group that focused on autonomous mobility, and he was he's a aeronautics engineer by training. So today we have him teaching us, telling us a few lessons from building a company of autonomous driving and how he thinks of urban driving now. Thank you.
Thank you, Pratik. Well, Pratik, something that you forgot to mention maybe is that, when we started the company, he was the one who wrote the first few lines of code, of the cars that are actually driving now in Las Vegas and other places. But anyway, thanks for the introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here. Something that probably you may not know is that actually this is the first seminar invitation that I've accepted, for over the past probably 5, 6, 7 years. So it's a really pleasure to be here. And, I chose to come here because I wanted to see, old friends, and GRASP is great, certainly a great institution, especially for robotics. So what I would like to talk today, well, probably, for example, from Pratik's introduction, and probably if you know something about my past work, probably you expected me to talk, about some motion planning, or maybe some autonomous vehicle, maybe some mobility systems or something like that. I'm not going to do that, okay? And in fact, a few years back, we were celebrating some milestone with the company, and we had all of our investors there at a big party and things like that. And this friend of mine, the first investor in the company, asked me, okay, now, Emilio, now that you have solved the autonomous driving problem, right? Because clearly we had solved it. So now that you have solved this one, what are you going to do next? So what is the next big challenge? Okay. And of course, there are many big challenges in the world, right? So cure for cancer, global warming, and all other things. But something that was really dear to my heart is what I see as a big problem that actually can lead to our destruction faster than global warming. That is, essentially the way that I put it at the time was curation of online content. Okay, so what we see is Twitter and Facebook and things like that are social networks are rapidly destroying, the form of government that the Greeks invented millennia ago, right? And now you see democracy is in trouble all over the world, right? So I think that is kind of like an important problem that should be looked at. And I'm happy to say that I'm getting to that through a little bit of a circuitous route that I will explain, but essentially this is, the context in which you should consider, essentially what I will talk about today, okay? So the idea here is that we as a species, right, mankind, evolved to interact in small groups, okay? So we have many examples of this, right? So, and we kind of like tend to be generous, we tend to be nice, but that's easier to do if you are in small groups. Right? And we have examples from everyday life, right? So you just walking into a building, right? And there is a door and there is somebody else coming. It's kind of natural for people to maybe open the door for somebody else that is coming, right? And then there is this, I find it a little bit funny, right? So sometimes there are double doors, right? So then you open the first one, and then the person who you just let through, they kind of like race to the next one so that they open it for you, right? So you see that people are kind of nice, right? Or have this other example, right? So in I grew up in Italy, right? So we have all these kinds of traditions. For example, when you go to the office, it's kind of like a bad manners to start the day by sitting at the desk, right? So then you see your friends and let's go have some coffee, right? So you go and have coffee. Also, it's considered bad manners for everybody to pay for their own coffee. So what you do is, somebody goes to the, cashier, what are you having? What are you having? And then you order for everybody and you pay for it. Now, the idea here is that typically you do it one day, and then the next day you expect somebody else to do it for you, right? And maybe there are some people who do it more frequently, maybe because of higher status, or maybe because of lower status. Anyway, so there are reasons why people may want to do it more frequently or not. But overall, you develop this kind of economy, right, where you know that people are nice to you, you are nice to them. And however, what happens is that if you detect somebody who is always a freeloader, right, they never pay for coffee. After some point, it gets on your nerves, right? And then maybe that person, you don't invite the person anymore, right? So, right. And this is for coffee. This goes beyond my cognitive ability, but for example, when we go to Italy for vacation and we see friends, there is a very complicated mechanism that my wife can follow of how many times those persons have invited us for dinner and who paid for what. So, I think that, these kind of things is actually, common in our life, right? So, and there are a number of reasons why this kind of like a trait has evolved, right? So, in a sense, we as a group, as a society, are better off if people are nice, right, to one another, right? But there is this notion that you want to detect cheaters like freeloaders, right? And you want to punish them, okay? So there are a lot of, other ways of looking at this. But the problem that I see today, and this is the social network and all those things, but not only social networks, but, just imagine life in a small village, like in a tribe, right? And then we go to bigger cities, and then now we have, like big metropolis, like a mega cities, right? So, and then we go even from the mega city, now we have the digital world where essentially we interact with everybody, essentially everybody in the world, right? So now we go from a situation where our interactions are with people that we see pretty much every day, to people that we see kind of every week, to people that we may see some point in our life, to people that we will never see in our life, right? So, and our ability to interact with others has evolved far beyond our cognition, our cognitive abilities, right? So, and now what we have is today, we have a lot of interactions are actually mediated by algorithms, by some form of automation, okay? And this automation is driving interactions in a way that is completely alien to our psychology, right? Our cognitive abilities. And I think that this has a number of consequences, and all of them are not necessarily good, okay? So typical examples, in principle, now with the internet, with all these social networks, you have access to a whole lot of information, right? And you have unprecedented opportunity for discussion and sharing knowledge and, really moving whole of humanity forward, right? But then instead of that, what we get is, polarization of society, right? We have echo chambers, right? So the only thing that you see online are the things that are fed to you by algorithms. These are the things that you want to see, right? You don't get a different point of view, right? So, and then you have all these things that really conspire, as I was saying before, there's a danger to the way that we are organizing our society, okay? Or less controversial example, maybe, let's say that you use Uber, right? So then you ask for a ride, and then the Uber algorithm matches you with some driver, right? And does it in a way that it's kind of transparent to you. You cannot really influence it, right? So you cannot say, I actually had this thing that happened to me. So I was in Zürich. I called a Uber. Uber arrived, and then it saw that it was me with my wife, 3 children, and some luggage. And as I just turned around to open the door and get the luggage for my children, the guy disappeared. What the heck? Okay. And then they charged me for the cancer ride. Okay. And then, as if this was not enough, then I went to see friends, and then I had to come back. I called Uber again. Guess who I got matched with? This guy who appeared again. And it was a very awkward ride back. Okay. So anyway, so you don't get to choose, right? So some automation chooses for you, right? And now you want to, how do you make sure that you get matched with people that you like and vice versa, right? So can you express, any kind of preferences? This is something that you have absolutely no control over. Okay. Again, this is another example where human interaction is delegated to some form of automation, right? So, clearly there are ways around it, right? So, for example, when you are in an Uber car and it's a nice car, it's a nice driver, polite things, I very often ask, can you give me your business card? And then next time I'll just call you up directly, right? So you can override this, okay? Now, I work a lot on mobility systems, right? So, typically when I was, especially the time when we were growing the company, I was focusing on, let's say that I have a fleet of robotaxis. How do I increase my market share? How do I increase the profitability of my company? Of course, now you can also start thinking about, from the point of view of society, how would such a transportation system integrate with all the other mobility offers? How do you build a system that is not only efficient, but is also fair and equitable to the population, right? Because, for example, what we see is that Uber is great, right? But essentially what Uber is doing is kind of cannibalizing the transportation in the downtown area, and is making more difficult for the public services to offer their service to the suburban or the rural areas, right? So there are a number of questions, right? So it is important for me to think about, how you manage resource sharing in infrastructure that, should be efficient, fair, and of course, this must be dealt with in a way that is scalable, right? So in a sense, we have this, I think that Rosina has a question or something. Okay. Okay, if there are questions, maybe on the chat, maybe you guys can monitor it and monitor the chat and let me know. Okay, so let's think about these three objectives, right? So we have, we want to have something that is efficient, right? So we'll have precise definitions for these things, but now let's go with the intuitive version of efficiency. Okay, we want to have something that is efficient, that is fair, right? And again, I will define it better. But also we want to something that is scalable, right? Because we need to deploy these algorithms at a massive scale, okay? So if you have some form of centralized control, right? So you have like a big brother or something, benevolent big brother or something that is trying to provide an efficient service, but making sure that everybody has access to it and so on and so forth, that would be great, but it's not very scalable, okay? Well, you can say, well, if you are in a small village, right, and you have this system of reputation, right, so you know everybody else, right, and then this guy needs help, doing work on their little field, right, or or this guy needs help, building his house, whatever, or a fence, right? So okay, so then he's been nice to me, he helped me building my fence, I help him painting his shed, whatever, right? So this is something that can be efficient, can be fair, right? But it's not scalable, right? So you go beyond the village and you cannot do it. Today's answer typically for all these things is money, right? So essentially you use money as a measure of your contribution to society in a sense, right? In an ideal world, right? And then if you need something from society, from others, to provide a service to you, you just pay them, right? Now, the problem here is that the monetary market is actually not as efficient as what people think, right? Because the monetary market would be efficient if everybody started with zero at birth, and the money that they accumulate is a measure of their contribution to society, right? And then every time they do something for others, they get some money, and every time others do something for them, they transfer some money to them, right? This is clearly not the case. So even the common way of exchanging services or sharing resources is tied to cost of some sort. This is not even, the most efficient way of doing things. Clearly scalable, right? This is the way that the world runs. So now the idea that we are exploring is this idea of karma, which is something that we see as is a mechanism for sharing resources in an automated way that is efficient, is fair, but is also scalable. Okay. So yeah, so there's a little bit of a redundant slide, right? So there's a big brother, right? Centralized control, right? So what is the problem with centralized control is that it can be expensive, difficult to implement, and then you had to trust it, right? Okay, so this is really not feasible at a large scale. Now it's you can think of the social credit system that, for example, has been developed in China or other places, right? So, but every time I hear about that, I think about this Black Mirror episode. I don't know if you've seen it. I mean, if you haven't, just watch it. Okay, it's called Nosedive. It's this story about this. There is this world in which everybody can rate other people on their phone, right? And then essentially your average rating, your number of stars is essentially a measure of your status, right? And then what happens is that this girl is invited to a wedding by some higher ranking girl, and she's all excited. She goes to the airport, and then was some problem with like a delayed flight or a missed flight or something, and then she gets a little bit frustrated and angry and vents at the person at the counter, and then this person gives her a bad rating, and then all things go downhill from there. Okay, so watch it, right? So again, this works great, but you lose the authority to have best interest, everybody, best interest in mind. You trust other people to be kind of like honest and fair and truthful in your assessment, right? And then there are these no unintended consequences, as in the Black Mirror episode. Okay. Now, the thing is that it turns out that efficiency and fairness can be achieved through selflessness, altruism, right? So be nice to one another. Okay. This is something that has been observed in humans, has been observed also in other animal societies. Okay, so monkeys, apes, they they groom each other, right? And this is something that builds kinship, like builds like a group cohesion, and all the apes are better off if they groom one another rather than if they're stuck with all their bugs on their body, right? So this is actually good for them, right? So again, this is only feasible in small communities. Now, this is something that has been observed, right? But this is also something that you can explain from the theoretical point of view, from a game theory point of view, right? So it actually turns out that any efficient Nash equilibrium, so any efficient outcome in a game is a Nash equilibrium if you repeat the game sufficiently many times, okay, infinitely many times, okay? So, and what is it based on? Essentially, if there is an efficient outcome, even though it may be not a Nash equilibrium in the one instance of the game, if somebody deviates, right, from that outcome, from that particular strategy, then everybody else will punish them, right? And this is exactly this idea that we tend to be nice, but we kind of keep an eye on people, and we have developed this very keen sense of detecting cheaters, right? And you actually see this in 2 years old, right? So, typically, what you get, like a complaint from children that, oh, that's not fair, right? Because they get, they got fewer cookies than their brother or something like that, right? So they have a very keen sense of fairness, right? So something that develops very, very early, okay? Now, if you want to do this, you require information about all, what other people have done in their past, their identity, and so on and so forth, right? So if you are dealing with somebody that you have never seen before in your life, and probably you will never see again in your life, how do you keep track of whether or not, they're fair, right? So mechanisms that are in place, monetary markets, right? So we say that, okay, so money is a universal measure of what your contribution to society have been so far, right? And how much you're willing to pay, how much benefit you think that you will get from something, right? So the problem with that is that my utility, right? So, or my willingness to pay for something does not depend on the something only, depends on how much I have in my bank account, right? So if I have millions in the bank, who cares, I can pay for whatever services, maybe, like a high amount, right? So it's a friend of mine, the guy who asked me about the big challenges, is a very wealthy individual, right? So whenever he goes to London, he says, I'm happy because they have congestion pricing. That means I can, go downtown, no traffic at all, because I don't care about paying, right? So, so even though there are efficient monetary mechanisms, they are not as efficient as we think. Well, first of all, because not everything can be measured in dollars, right? But also there are a number of issues, right? So, for example, I said that a lot of things depend on how much money you have in the bank. Now, everything would be great, as I said before, if everybody started at zero, and then the money that you have in the bank is a measure of, essentially is a record of your services to society. Unfortunately, that is not the case, because money can be made honestly, or money can be made honestly, right? So the kind of way that is technically legal, kind of, right? So there is also too much memory, right? So do you deserve more because your dad or your grandfather or somebody else made a lot of money? And usually a lot of, these cases where you have, really a lot of money is because some of your grandparents was very adept at killing people from the other tribe, right? So, and then he became the king or the duke or something, right? So, or you make money by handling money, right? So you have, it is known that the essentially you can, essentially the more money you have, the more efficient your investment become, right? So I mean, you're better off just by having more money, right? And then, there is no standard map from service to money, so different people can be paid different amounts for the same job, right? And and also if you think of it, it's the lowest possible encoding of your history of service of contribution to society, right? Because it's just a scalar, right? So, and there could be many dimensions which you want to measure these things, okay? So then it's not really great thing to to deal with a shared resource, right? Again, we are thinking of this karma. And how did I get to karma? Okay, believe it or not, but again, this comes from the motion planning, self-driving car, kind of problems. And we are thinking of, okay, let's say that you have two autonomous cars that meet at an intersection, okay? Now what we have is traffic lights, or we have stop signs, which are mechanisms that in a sense are fair, right? But they're not necessarily efficient, okay? The idea is the following, right? So what if these two cars meet at an intersection and one is just going for a ride and they're not in a special rush, right? And the other one is maybe they're rushing to the ER, or maybe they're late for a meeting or something. They have a very high urgency, okay? Now, who gets to go first? Okay, so ideally, and for example, you see this in the example of opening the door, right? So if you see somebody coming with carrying like a big package or a suitcase, then you kind of like go and help them out, right? Is there an equivalent for cars, right? So, or any two individuals that want to share a resource, right? So, right, and okay, so start a little bit with the modeling, right? So imagine that each person has a certain, urgency each day, and where this urgency is something is generated by essentially like a Markov chain, okay? So each day you have certain urgency with a certain probability. The next day you will have another urgency, and so on and so forth, okay? So again, if it, in a small community, right, you can just tell the other, hey, can you let me through? I'm really in a rush today, okay? And then, generally you would say yes. If this somebody tells you that he's in a rush every day, after a while, you say, well, just wake up earlier, okay? So, okay, so you don't want to do that. But then, how does reputation work in the same if you never see the same person again, right? So how do you have an efficient allocation of these resources, right? So for example, what you can say is, let's say that you want to maximize efficiency, right? And then in that case, for example, you have a fair mechanism that is like a towing cost, right? But the towing cost could be fair, but it's not efficient, right? Because it ignores the fact that somebody may have a high urgency and the other person has a low urgency, right? So it doesn't matter, right? So the coin toss is agnostic to private needs, okay? How about fairness, right? So fairness is actually a little bit of a loaded term, can have several meanings. So for example, what you can say is that fairness is equal opportunity or access to the resource, right? So the probability that A goes first is equal to the probability of B goes first. Or fairness is equal outcome, right? So equal cost, right? Or equal advantage, right? So then equal benefit. So you have the expectation of the cost of A, should be of red. It should be equal to the expectation of the cost of blue, okay? Now, these things, there is another one that is, you can think of a reparation cost, right? So essentially what you have is that the expectation, the future cost, given the past cost, right? So if you, and this is the way that, for example, a coin toss is not necessarily fair right? Because the coin toss is fair ex ante, is not fair ex post, right? So essentially what you have is a random walk for each person, right? And it can happen that you have been really unlucky and you really had a lot of negative outcome with the coin toss, but the fact that that will not influence future coin tosses, right? So whereas you may want to say, well, okay, so you have been unlucky all these times, I'll give you a break today, right? So how do you incorporate that, right? So again, you can solve like a monetary solution, right? So monetary solutions are not fair, right? Because even though the road is a public good, not everybody has the same money, right? So you can have the person who is rushing to the hospital who is living on a budget, right? And then the guy on a leisurely drive on their Bentley, right, has a lot of money, right? So the person with a lot of money may prevail in this monetary transaction just because he has more money, right? So it's not fair access to the resource, okay? Right, so essentially your willingness to pay is not proportional or is not uniformly proportional to your urgency, okay? So anyway, so monetary solutions are efficient only under a certain limited set of assumptions, okay? So enter karma, okay? So what is the idea? Okay, so now you are, you have a certain, let's start with saying that, okay, so you have a certain urgency, and then you have a certain amount, a certain budget, karma budget of this thing that we will define later, okay? So let's say that the red car has karma 7, right? It's very high urgency. The blue car has karma 5, whatever this karma is, right? So then each car bids how much karma of this resource that they are accumulating, they're willing to pay for access to the resource, okay? So I have 7 karma units. I have high urgency. I bid 4, okay? The other car is really not in a rush, so he bids 1. So then I win, the red wins the auction, right? So pays the karma to the blue car, and then the red car gets to go first. Okay, so then what you see is that the blue car is yielding the resource, increasing their karma. Okay, whereas the red car uses some of their karma to get access, preferential access to the resource. Okay, now the blue car has accumulated karma, right? And now in interaction with another yellow car, right? Now it can use this accumulated karma due to the interaction with somebody else, right? But can use this karma to get preferential access to the resource when they need it in the interaction with this car that they've never seen before. Okay. Okay. So the thing is that, okay, so karma has no value outside of going first at intersections. Okay, so in the money world, right, so you put some monetary value to going first at the intersection, right? In the karma world, what you can do is you have to decide how much of your accumulated karma you want to invest into trying to get preferential access to a resource, right? So you can bid too much, right? Because, okay, so I want to go first now, right? But then, of course, going first now means that I will have less karma to use in the future, okay? Or I may be a little bit more, let's say, sensitive about my future needs, right? So then I bid too little, right? Because I want to keep karma, right? Because I'm worried about my future, right? So what in someday in the future will be even more in a rush than today, okay? And so then, the problem here is how do you optimally bid for access to the resource based on your urgency and based on the karma that you have, right? And based on how you discount time, okay? And essentially what you have is a dynamic, what we call is a dynamic population game, right? So essentially what you have for each individual, you have a state that is the urgency. Remember that the urgency is driven by this Markov chain, right? So my urgency today may be different from my urgency tomorrow and in the future. Karma is something that I accumulate. Then my action at every interaction is I choose how much karma I want to bid, okay? What is the social state? And of course, the outcome of my bid depends not only on how much I bid, but how much other people bid and how much their urgency is, right? Actually, how much they bid depends on how much urgency they have, right? So essentially now we have this social state. It is the probability that is given by the distribution of states and what is the policy, okay? So then what you have is this, for each individual, you have this Markov decision process, right? Where you have this Markov chain that determines, how your urgency evolves, right? But also now you place in bids and then how your karma also evolves, right? And now what you get is, okay, turns out that, even though you have the game that is played every day is different. So, best response fixed point is not enough, but what you have is under some technical assumptions, you can show that you do have a stationary Nash equilibrium, okay? So essentially you have a social state where the state distribution is stationary and the policy is the best response, given that stationary distribution, okay? So the assumption that you need is a continuity, and then one of the assumptions that we chose to put is karma preservation. So essentially you had to make sure that whenever you do these transactions, the total karma remains constant, okay? That ensures the probability distribution stays in a compact set, and then you have convergence to this Nash equilibrium, okay? And then, this is essentially what happens. So we have this example where we have three states, okay? So one is a low urgency state, that's the green one. Then we have an intermediate state. The intermediate state is one where your urgency is low, but you kind of have a sense that you have a high probability that the next day you will be in a rush, okay? And then, the stationary, Nash equilibrium that you get is something like this, okay? So in these figures, what you see is, the ones at the top is, on the horizontal axis, we have how much karma we have. And on the vertical axis is how much karma we are willing to bid, okay, given the karma that we have, okay? So you see that on the right-hand side, you're very high urgency, and you see that you're willing to bid more karma than if you are in the low urgency state. Now, it's interesting in this anticipatory storage state where you are in a low urgency, but you think that you will be more urgency tomorrow, you're kind of like a saving karma because, okay, I will be in trouble tomorrow, so let's be nice to people today so that I can, it can be a little bit selfish tomorrow, okay? And you see that also the distribution of karma, changes, depending on, on your state. Okay. And now what turns out that, we do simulations for, like a number of cases. And then what you get is the following, right? So if you look at this plot, what we have is efficiency and efficiency on the horizontal axis, fairness on the vertical axis. You see that just a coin toss is not efficient because it doesn't take into account the individual urgency, right? It's not fair because it's not fair ex post, right? So it can happen that people just get unlucky, right? Taking turns, it is fair, right? Because in terms of access, because everybody gets to go first every once in a while, right? But again, it's not efficient. Money can be efficient, but it's not fair, right? Because it depends on how much money you have in the bank, right? And what we find is that actually this karma mechanism allows us to really get to combine the efficiency with the fairness, and also since this is driven by pairwise interactions, is something that is very scalable. Okay. Now, what we see here is that actually we are looking at different mechanisms. So karma, PBP, is a pay bid to peer, right? So you interact with somebody, you bid karma, and if you win the auction, you pay the bid to your peer that you interact with. Or in other cases, you don't have an individual that you're interacting with, so that you pay your bid and then you pay to society. Okay, so these are all like slightly different mechanisms. Okay. Anyway, so yeah, so we get this near optimal efficiency and fairness, right, with a scalable algorithm. Now, and there are a lot of things that happen. Okay, so in a sense, really excited about this thing, and in a sense, we are reinventing. In many ways, this is kind of like an artificial money, right? So, how do you come up with the axioms on how you deal with money if you were to redesign it from scratch, if only for a limited kind of like a set of interactions? Okay. For example, you can have the case in which you have a group that is much more patient, or much more like long-term thinking than the other group, right? So then what happens is, as you can expect, the group that is more patient tends to accumulate a lot of karma, right? Because they're saying, okay, so I may be in a rush today, but I'm afraid there will be in a really emergency situation tomorrow, so I'll just save my karma, right? And then what happens is that actually these people who have hoarded all this karma, then eventually they actually get preferential access to the resources, right? So it's something, and then you say, well, yeah, but they deserve it because they saved all their life, so it's okay. Or you may say, well, but it's actually not really that efficient, so we should try to encourage people to use their karma, right, rather than saving it forever, right? And then there are all these other questions. Okay, so this person has saved karma forever, they die, what happens to their karma? Do you give it to to their children, or you? And you see that there are all these questions that arise, that human society has somehow answered in some way, may not be the best way, right? But then all these questions arise. But there is another point that arises in this case: is what if, let's say that we decide that hoarding karma is not great. Okay, we want to encourage people to use their karma. What is the mechanism to encourage people to use their karma? Tax their karma, right? So and then you can impose a progressive tax on karma, right? So, okay, at every cycle, every year, we look at your karma, and you had to take 5% of it and redistribute to society, to everybody else, right? Remember that karma is preserved, right? So, and that clearly has the effect that it shifts the distribution of karma, so discourages excessive hoarding. And this has clearly consequences on the reduces a little bit the gap on the expected cost for these two different groups. Okay, and again, these are
There's a one way that it is different from money, in the sense that you cannot use karma tokens for yielding to buy coffee.
Right.
So it doesn't matter how much you hoard.
That's a very great question, and I'll get to it in a second, right? So essentially, this is exactly the point, because people say, oh, but you're just doing artificial money. No, it's not artificial money, right? And there are some situations where, I don't know if I have a slide on that. No, actually I don't have it. But anyway, so for example, there is something that people are thinking of, for example, for access to mobility infrastructure, right? So for example, if you want to access some fast lane, or maybe you want to travel on some congested, or some equivalent of congestion pricing, things like that, is this something is called tradable mobility credits. Okay, so essentially the idea is you have these credits, and then if you use these credits, you can take the fast lane, or you can enter downtown area, or things like that. The problem with tradable mobility credits is their tradability. In particular, they can be traded with money, right? So anything that, if you have an artificial currency that can be traded for real currency, is a real currency in a sense, right? So, and then has all the problems of unfairness that you have with money, right? And there are a lot of things, for example, this part of a closed economy, this is actually not too far from reality because, for example, something that you're not allowed to do, at least in most of the world that I know of, is that you cannot trade body parts for money, right? I cannot sell you a kidney. I have to, I give you a kidney for $10,000. You cannot do that, right? Even though in some cases you may want to do that, you're not allowed. That's something that is considered inappropriate, right? However, there are mechanisms by which you are allowed to trade kidneys, right, or body parts. And the way you do it is you trade a kidney for another kidney, right? So maybe you have your child who, or some relatives that needs a new kidney. You're willing to donate yours to them, but you're not compatible, right? So then there are all these schemes by which you find somebody for whom you can be a donor, and then you give your kidney to them, and then somebody else give their kidney to your relative, right? So we see examples of situations where monetary transactions are forbidden or frowned upon, whereas transactions in a closed market are actually allowed, right? So I think that this is really the difference, right? So you have something that really allows us to automate the natural tendency of humans of going by reputation, right? Of valuing reputation, but reputation, how do you deal with reputation when you go beyond the village and you go to the global scale, okay? And in many ways is better than money, right? Now, so this is an alternative to using money as a mechanism when allocating common goods. As Pratik said, is there is this issue, right? That this is something that is a closed economy. In my example, I could use karma only to go first at the intersection. I cannot use it to buy coffee, right? But then the questions are, would different systems need different karma counts? Or how do you compose karma systems, right? So that these kind of like a closed bubble economies can actually translate, convert your currency in a certain economy to a currency, your karma in other economies, right? Also, we realize that fairness is kind of like high dimensional, right? So there are a lot of things that you need to take into account. But another thing that I wanted to say is that there are several examples. So I kid you not, I started all this work by thinking about who goes first at intersections. Okay, but clearly you can do this for access to mobility infrastructure, access to charging infrastructure. Think about Twitter, social networks, right? So what is the resource that you're using, that you're consuming in social network like Twitter? The resource is people's attention, right? So if you have accounts that have hundreds of thousands of followers, and this person sends a message or a tweet, and then hundreds of thousands of people kind of had to read it, maybe you want this person to have read order of 100,000 messages first, right? So, how do you, okay, of course, now what you have is Twitter Blue, right? So, okay, so you pay $15 a month or whatever, right? And then you have privileged access to Twitter. But, is charging money the right thing here, or is really requiring that people have read enough so that they are kind of, they have the authority in a sense of the right reputation to write something that other people read, right? So I think that there are many situations in which you may want to think about how you allocate resources by some mechanism, of this form, right? So, and for me, what are the, some important aspects of this karma, right? So for me, this is a way that, how do you automate and scale up the natural tendency of humans to rely on other people's reputation and history and track record. So people want to be selfless, they want to be generous, but they want to detect people who are, too selfish and too ungenerous, right? So karma is fair because it's closed and regulated, right? So you cannot buy karma with other wealth. So that's important. And for me, another important thing is that you can only accumulate karma by yielding resources to others. So you need to suffer, okay? To accumulate karma, you need to have skin in the game and suffer, right? So you cannot accumulate karma by not participating in the intersection game, right? So if you stay at home, never go to an intersection, it's not that you're accumulating karma, and then so then I have enough karma, and then I go on the road, and then I can just go first everywhere, right? So in order to accumulate karma, you need to have yielded to others in other situations. Okay, so maybe you do it in situation where you are in like a low urgency, right? But then even in the case in which you are low urgency, you're ready to wait for others, right? Because and then that's the way you gain karma. Okay. And you know what we have is that karma achieves high efficiency, fairness, population of self-interested players. So even though everybody is self-interested, people tend to be generous, and this karma mechanism allows you to be generous even in interactions with people that you will never see again in your life. Okay. And okay, so this is one of the amazing things in this research. So we started thinking about intersections. Okay, who goes first at the intersection? And we end up, you know, talking in meetings that we had with my students, with my associates, to really talk about, in a sense, theology, right, and the meaning of life. I don't know if you read this. This is a short story, 3 pages, you know, 3-minute read. Okay, this is a story where there is this person who dies, and then you know, he wakes up in, well, whatever, in the other world, right? And then there is this god-like figure that welcomes him. So, what the heck happened? Oh, you died. Okay, what's gonna happen next? Oh, you will be reincarnated, right? And oh, really? So where we go? Oh, you will be like a Chinese peasant girl from 500 AD or something, right? So, and essentially the idea is that this person gets reincarnated and lives the life of every single human who has ever lived or will ever live, right? And so this person will be Hitler, right? And will be all the people that Hitler killed, will be Jesus, and will be all the followers of Jesus, right? So it will be every single person. And the idea is that this is a God in training, right? So once you have experienced human life in all possible aspects, right? All the people that you were generous with, that you made happy, all the people that you made miserable, you will live both lives, right? You will see both aspects, right? And in a sense, this is karma, right? Because essentially what you're playing the game is a game that you're playing against different versions of yourself in the future, right? Or in the past, right? So, and you know, for me, this is the way that you can look at it. And this mechanism is a way by which you can actually automate this process, right? And make it something that you can implement on a device, and really gives you this notion of gaming, you know, or this reputation game, right? On a very vast scale. Okay, so I will stop here. Thank to my collaborators here. Edzard is the PhD student who is really leading the charge on this work, and Andrea, he was really one of the key initiators of the whole idea, and then we are working with Saverio Bolognani and Florian Dorfer at ETH. Okay, so I think that we are on the top of the half hour, so take questions and go move to the panel. Thank you.
So like that was a very interesting talk. So I have 2 questions. So the first question is, so like some people are just nice, right? And so like their karma just like keep going up, and no matter it gets taxed or not, they're just nice. So in that sense, wouldn't the karma system be doing nothing? And my second question is, so the whole system like falls under social science and sociology. So it's a complex system, and you can't like really know what will happen. So how do you plan to carry out or like roll out some real world experiment to understand how exactly it works?
Yeah, these are very good questions. Okay, so the first one is some people are nice, right? So I think that the problem here is not that, that people, how to prevent people from being nice. I think that the problem here is how to prevent people from being selfish, right? So then essentially this is the idea, right? So Maybe in general, I'm not in a rush. I'm a very calm person, and I tend to wake up early so I don't get late for work and things like that. I'm perfectly fine to let other people, but it really bothers me if somebody every day is in a rush. As I said before, just wake up earlier, right? So I think that is more of a mechanism to try to prevent people from taking unfair advantage, right? Versus reducing selflessness, right? Because selflessness at the end of the day makes everybody happier, right? So and there are these measures of fairness that are a little bit more complicated than they may seem, right? So maybe some people just gain some pleasure from just being generous to others, right? So and you don't want to stop that, right? Now, how do you implement this? And this is a very good question. For me, this is one of the things that I'm a big supporter. I really like the idea of blockchain, even though I think that blockchain is much bigger than cryptocurrencies. Okay. And for example, what you can have is a kind of like an automated mechanism. You have think of like a blockchain ledger that keeps track of your reputation, something that of your karma, right? Something that you cannot mess with, right? But then what you want to do is something that you want to avoid is every time you go to an intersection to start an auction, right? So with everybody else. So I bid 5 karma. Oh, I bid 3 karma. So I think that what you need to develop is something that is some kind of like automated thing where essentially as you approach an intersection, you have some device on your car, some device on their cars that communicate and then say, okay, so you get to go, right? And then maybe something that you can have on your dashboard, imagine like a karma gauge, right? So say, how much karma you have. Red, you have very little. Green, you have a lot. And then you can say, oh, today I'm in a rush. So, just go for it, just beat karma, right? And then this implement the policy that depends on your karma availability and your urgency. Essentially, you state your urgency, right? But you can think of ways. I mean, of course, at this point, this is more like a notional rather than a device or a system that we have deployed, right? But I think that there is value in looking at what are these means to automatically keep track of reputation so that you can enable the selfless and generous nature that is kind of implicit in humans, right? But do it at a scale that is not implicit in humans, right? So we did not evolve to interact with millions of other people. We evolved to interact with order of 100 people, right?
Thanks for working on these monstrously hard problems. Very brave of you. It seems like there are 2 different bad limiting situations. One, of course, is where your karma system gets invaded by money and subsumed within money. But the other one that you didn't talk so much about is the opposite problem of vectorizing, because everybody else is then going to set up their, I'll set up you have your karma mechanism, I have Marka, and you can protect privacy by putting it up on the blockchain. But now you've got a vectorized version, and you kind of isn't it a very unstable world to have everybody setting up a vectorized version and you lose your system?
You're thinking of like a parallel karmas, like a different currencies for the same resource. Yeah. No, it's for me that's the thing, right? Because that's why when I was talking about compositionality of karma, right? So, I mean, clearly if you have just one karma currency for one particular application, then things are easy. But now you can say, okay, so now I have 2 issuers of karma, right? And I have 2 karma budgets, right? So how do we, this kind of like a parallel of karmas, how do you do it? But you can also have, okay, now I have 2 different markets, right? 2 different economies, and can I transfer karma from one to the other, right? So these are all questions that are still open. I don't know yet. So, but this is one of the interesting things. But for me, the important thing is that, so you cannot trade karma for these, let's say, unfair, currencies, right? And for me, the other important thing is that you really need to have skin in the game to gain karma, right? So for example, because some mechanism that you can think of is, what if karma, instead of being tied to you as an individual, is tied to your car? Then you are a wealthy individual. You can just pay somebody, just take my car and just drive around, yield to everybody, right? So then, you see that I'm transferring money, like wealth, monetary wealth, to some mechanism by which I can, accumulate karma, right? So that's why for me it's important, this notion of skin in the game, where you really have to give up some precious commodity or some precious resource that you have in order to gain karma, right? Yeah, and then everything else is kind of like a lot of open questions. But I find this, as I said, for me it's unbelievable. So I remember sitting with Andrea, right, and we were talking about, okay, so in intersections you have stop sign, you have traffic lights. Is there a better mechanism? Right? And then we started thinking about this thing, and then we ended up with the egg, right? And what is the meaning of life and the universe, and how do you become a god, right? So this fascinating. You rediscover things like taxes, and you rediscover things. How do you deal with inheritance, right? And things like that. And and how would you do it in a way that we get to decide, right? So anyway, I don't have all the questions, but I find it very interesting. Yeah.
Do you have any other parameters that come up in your discussion about how to improve decision making? For instance, you have to use some karma, assuming that what do you come up with different systems that maybe accomplish?
These are all good questions, and you can think of, for example, like an ambulance is an extreme example, because in a sense it's something that has the the flashing light and siren, things like that, is the status of an emergency vehicle. But think about maybe a doctor that is going to visit a patient like urgently, right? Or think of an essential worker, right? That needs to go to work to do something that is beneficial to society, right? So again, this is, should these people that provide the service to society get some karma bonus, in a sense, right? So again, but this is, you see, this is a system where you transfer some credit in one side of the economy to another side of the economy. So these are things that we need to work on, right? But this is not clear. But yeah, I think that. So there was a question over there. Yeah.
Broadly, and then I'm curious what you think some of the failure modes of like, and one example of this actually one that you said, you can't accumulate karma and you sit in your house all day. You have to have some sort of skin in the game. But really, I would think you'd want to reward that person more than someone who has a free day to kill and decides to drive around, sort of get people's way, and then accept their karma.
Yeah. Well, this is a very interesting question, and these are one of the things that we are considering, right? Because for example, karma can be used to get access to some transportation system, right? And then you can say, okay, a person who decides to stay home and not imposing, right, increasing the load on the transportation system, in a sense, should be rewarded. And I would say yes, but as long as that person would have used the transportation system, right? So if that person has absolutely no interest in using it, then maybe they should not be rewarded for not using something that they would not use anyways, right? So again, it's a skin in the game. So I would really like to do it, but I am very conscious about the environmental impact of making this choice, for example. So instead of going, you know what, I will stay home. And that in that case, I agree that you should get your karma reward, right? But otherwise, maybe not. And for me, this is something that is a little bit hard to quantify exactly. But for me, this notion of you need skin in the game is important, right? Because essentially you have to give up something that you value in order to get karma. Okay, if you don't, then maybe not. Okay, how do you quantify this? How do you formalize this? I don't know yet, or I don't know in all cases. There were questions around here.
If you have a question, please speak into the mic because the online people can't hear. But right now, let's do an online question. Ruzana, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Well, I was just wondering, it caught my eyes what you say, karma achieves high efficiency and fairness for a population of self-interested players. Well, there is a group of self-interested players, and those are the policemen. Have you had any conversation with those people?
A short answer is I have not. Yeah, at this point, this is more like, as I was saying before, it's just a notional, right? So is it possible to build a system that can regulate transactions, interactions between individuals, encouraging the natural tendencies towards being generous, right? But preventing people from abusing the system, essentially.
Right.
So yeah, so I haven't talked to policemen or any particular group of potential constituents at this point.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I imagine in some situations there may be some people with like permanently higher urgency. So for example, for parking, if you have a disability of some sort, you may have a constant urgency to get the closer spots. In this case, is the expectation that these individuals have to constantly give up something else in other aspects, or are there other ways to accommodate this?
I think that, this is a perfectly, good example of people that you may say that they deserve to have a higher karma allocation. Yeah. As I was saying before, they could be the essential workers or, ambulances or, doctors going to some, or some emergency responder, prime responders, things like that, people with disabilities. And, one of the things that I mentioned, right? So for example, the notion of fairness is something that is very loaded and it's not not clear what fairness means, right? And in particular can be like a multifaceted, like a notion of fairness, right? And in particular, what you can say is that not only the equal access, right, or equal cost, expected cost, but you can say something, well, somebody with a disability maybe should be allocated more, right? Because for me, fairness means that, for example, the difficulty for this person to get to the place where they want to go should be the same as somebody who has much better mobility, right? So then it's clear that this person with this disability should be able to park closer, right? So yeah, there are many ways to define fairness, right? And then you can allocate or you can design rules for the allocation of karma that reflect your desire for fairness.
I have a question for you. So I was wondering, so I in the sense you had this very closed and regulated system, and then you kind of hinted at maybe the potential of bridging different gaps between different tasks and situations. I think I like when it's closed though, before it opens up, because I feel like once you open up, you have the opportunity to game the system in different ways. You work hard at driving efficiently so that now I could use my karma at a different scale. So do you have some comments on that?
This is exactly the point of compositionality, right? So, for different systems, you need different karmas how do you combine this karma, right? How do you trade karma in one system for karma in another by avoiding all the pitfalls that we have with money or, the usual notion of money.
Yeah.
So in many ways, a lot of, very often, when we submit papers on these things, right? So the criticism is that, oh, so you're just reinventing money. And the answer is, well, this is not money, because money is designed to be kind of universal, right? So you can trade pretty much everything, excluding body parts, for money, right? Or most of the world, you don't do that. Whereas karma is something that is designed really to be a closed economy, right? So then how do you open it up? How do we composite different karmas, different currencies in a sense, right? How do you trade one for the other? This I don't know yet.
Maybe I'll sneak in an opportunity to ask a question. So I want to understand about the iterative game where this is a stable system. There are subcultures that emerge. If a driver who grew up driving in the US goes to drive in India, they have a totally different scale at which their karma accumulates, or they choose to accumulate it. So I want to ask the question whether this way of thinking gives you any insights into how these cultures emerge.
Oh, you mean as
There's a system of interacting agents. They have different units in which they pay and receive money or karma. And why do they localize as sub-communities?
Right. I mean, definitely I see that happening, right? So not done. Okay, so we have done experiments, but the experiments that we have done is students who are taking the game theory class, right? And then we ask them to participate in a karma game of some sort, right? So, and that's the only way we actually have empirical data, right? But that's also is kind of like made up, right? So, I see that happening, and keep in mind that so the karma mechanism, you can design it, right? But then the policies, that is the policy essentially, how do you decide how much to bid based on your urgency and on the karma that you have? That is something that depends on the specifics of where you are, right? In particular, depends on your urgency process, right? So I think I would imagine that different places in the world, different people have different urgency processes, right? So what you can have is that even though the mechanism is the same, different policies emerge in different places of the world, right? And then, since you do converge to those, right? So you can imagine that a person who drives in a foreign place, then hopefully soon will learn, how to. Right. But again, the idea is that you want to prevent people from being selfish too often, right? And essentially, is how do you keep track of reputation of people that you've never seen before, that you will never see again in your life. Right?
Yeah. Thank you so much for such an engaging talk.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for the questions. Please tune in again next Friday, same time, same place, for a talk by John Su from Hyundai Robotics. Follow on Twitter, Grasp, and YouTube if you want to hear more. One very important thing before everyone leaves, on the first floor or on the second floor there is the CIS open house. So please leave the auditorium from the first floor, from this door, okay? Otherwise, you will end up stealing their pizza and you will not be able to find your pizza. So, but on the most important note, the grass pizza is in Levin 403 today. So we have to go up to the 4th floor to